Winning games of Magic can be pretty difficult at the best of times, and what's worse is that often when we lose, we think it's because of one thing, but then in reality, we lost because of something completely different and we have absolutely no idea. We simply just didn't notice or realize it, because the things causing us to lose are often sneaky, tricksy, and far less obvious. It often wasn't a board of big creatures threatening to trample all over you, or the 6 untapped islands threatening to counter all of your spells. It was instead something far more scary, lurking out of sight and in the shadows. And for all of us, you don't know what you don't know, so often you won't even realize these things no matter how many games you play. But today I'm going to arm you with a flashlight and teach you how to see some of them, and then once you can, you won't be able to stop. So let's yap about what's losing you games of Magic. We'll start with tempo, which is one of the most important things to understand in the game of Magic. It's also very easy to get wrong. Tempo is all about how far a given player or deck has progressed down their specific game plan. Making a tempo-based play will often usually mean you're spending resources of some form, like cards or mana, to either further your own game plan or to slow down your opponents. Quite often a tempo play will see you trading permanent resources, like cards, for short-term temporary effects. And figuring out when that is a worthwhile trade versus when not is the key to making sure that tempo wins you the game. Tempo also looks very different depending on what kind of deck you or your opponents are piloting. For example, if you're playing an aggro deck, your goal is to play low to the ground threats and get in for damage every turn. For you, tempo plays are landing a threat early and then using disruption to destabilize opponents long enough for your low cost threats to get the job done by reducing their life total to 0. Disruption for you may look like tapping down their bigger creature so that they can't block, or it may look like countering a board wipe that would stabilize the game for them. On the flip side, if you're playing a control deck, the longer the game goes, the stronger your deck is and the more the game is playing into your ideal game plan. Because your game plan relies on outlasting your opponents in a resource battle. Most of the time, tempo plays for a control deck will involve us slowing down our opponents in any way that we can. The act of stunning or bouncing a creature now happens not to ensure that we deal damage, but to make sure that we don't take damage instead. If we were a deviant and we're playing some kind of combo deck, our goal is simply to assemble our combo and have some form of protection for that win condition. Tempo for us will usually be ramp and card draw or card selection, because these things will allow us to play our combo faster and will allow us to find the combo faster in the first place. Tempo plays in a combo deck could look like either that of a control deck or an aggro deck, depending on whether we're trying to stop creatures from killing us or to make sure a control player doesn't counter our spells. Knowing what type of deck you're playing against and what role you are playing in that specific matchup will give you tools to know if and when you should use your resources to make tempo-based plays. I'll use my experience in the 60-card Pauper format as an example to show what I mean. I was recently piloting my Dimir control deck, a deck that tries to counterspell or destroy my opponent's threats and then take control of the game. After that I employ my own threats, which are either small stubborn fairies, big angry snakes, or tons of birds. Most of the time I want the game to go as long as it can, because most of the time that means I'll have more mana, more cards, and more choices than my opponents. There are, however, a few times that this is not the case, and one such matchup is against the deck called Familiars. Without going into too much detail, their deck can draw far more cards than mine, and because their win conditions are to make many more birds than me, it means that the longer the game goes, the stronger that they get and the weaker that I get, effectively beaten by my own game plan. Damn. So what this means in this specific matchup is that I am now the aggro deck. If I try and play this matchup like a normal control deck where I run the amount of cards, I will just lose. So instead I need to try and present as many threats as I can early, like hard casting a sneaky stacker on turn 2 if need be, and then using my removal to take out their blockers and my counter magic to protect my creatures. Understanding this dynamic and making judgment calls on what kind of matchups you're in will allow you to start spotting situations where you otherwise just would have lost. Like that combo deck in the Commander game that's done absolutely nothing impactful other than ramping and drawing cards. They have no board presence and outwardly, they simply don't look like a threat. And then all of a sudden they've just said that they're going to win, 2 of the 4 players are tapped out, and the other one that had mana up for removal has just been counterspelled. Damn again. But hey, next time, you'll know better. Magic at its core is a battle of finite resources and how they are used. The app we just had about tempo is a great example. Tempo shapes how and when we choose to burn through our resources in the short term for a long-term gain. Don't burn through enough and you will likely lose. Burn too much and you will also probably lose. The trick is understanding and identifying how and when to use your resources. And mana is one area of resources that is critically important. Something that I love getting new players to think about is thinking about your available mana across the whole game rather than turn by turn, and then thinking about all the spells that we want to cast and how those spells will help us win the game. Tempo handles the turn by turn stuff pretty well, but thinking too short term can really hurt us when it comes to mana and resources. Let's use the counterspells as an example. If you hold up 2 mana for a counterspell every turn for say 3 turns in a row, but either chose not to play it or there's nothing worth countering, you've now wasted 6 mana. That could be as much as 30% of your total mana pool across the game, and you could have used that on something proactive to get you closer to your win conditions. It's partially for this reason that having proactive, instant speed spells that you can play at the end of your opponent's turns, especially card draw, are critically important when playing an abundance of interaction like counter magic. They allow you to mitigate the possible opportunity cost of holding up mana and not spending it. As a general rule, you want to be using as much of your available mana every turn, and the less that you do, the more you're fighting with one arm tied behind your back. You're literally throwing away resources, and that's a great recipe for losing. Now, it's obviously not that easy because sometimes you really need to hold up interaction, and sometimes you really need to choose to tap out and let your opponent have their way with you. But understanding the opportunity cost of either playing or not playing your spells, trying to maximize your mana usage, is the kind of play that creates lots of small incremental advantages that all add up to a win. One more thing you want to be aware of when it comes to mana management is the trade between what your threats cost and the cost to your opponents to deal with them, and vice versa. If you play a big scary threat like an Itali and I hit it with the Swords to Plowshares before it has a chance to attack, you're down 5 mana in that exchange. Of course, card advantage also matters, like using a board wipe to clear out a whole bunch of threats, but that's a whole other similar conversation. But again, these small things add up, and your opponent trading 1 mana for your 6 is a pretty great tempo swing in their favor. So we just yapped about holding open 2 blue mana for a counterspell. But what if you don't have a counterspell? Well, leaving up the 2 blue mana is often as good as a counterspell, as it may stop your opponent from casting that very spell that you don't want them to cast because they're worried about it being countered. Obviously, based on what we just spoke about, leave your mana open responsibly, as you really want to be maximizing it. But if you've got a cheap spell that you can cast with it later anyway, then there's really no downside and only upside. Bluffing, or rather allowing your opponent to think of the possible players available to you and then make assumptions, is a very important part of Magic. When learning anything, we go through the stages of competence. From unconscious incompetence, where we don't know that we don't know, to conscious incompetence, where we know that we don't know, to conscious competence, where we now know, but we have to actively think about it, to unconscious competence, where we now know, but we don't really have to actively think about it at all. Most Magic players fall into this conscious competence band. You have a rough idea of what your opponent's deck does and the options available to them, and how you would be piloting it. So that means when you see the 2 blue mana open, you quite rightfully worry about that counterspell, so now you start making decisions with that in mind. This is both very smart, but also not very smart at the same time. Depending on the state of the game and the player, that counterspell, if they have it, will be there now or later. If someone held up mana now, they probably will do that on the next turn as well. So instead of worrying about it, you're probably just far better off pretending that it doesn't exist, because again, it may not. It's a bit like that bell curve meme. On the one end, we have the unconsciously incompetent saying, just play the spell. The vast majority, the consciously competent, are sitting there worrying and losing their minds. And on the other end, the unconsciously competent person is just going, play the spell. And when in doubt, just play the spell. In almost all cases, that is the correct play, and your hope and goal is that you just make the play, but instead your opponent is locked in a glass case of emotion, dramatically overthinking what 2 open islands can do to them. Being aware of this and not getting caught in this trap yourself, whilst also creating this trap for your opponent, is how you master the art of the use of information. So being aware of the 2 open blue mana is a great example of reading available information in the game. Things like what your opponents have in play, how much mana they have, how many cards they have in their hand, and what's in their graveyard all give you valuable information that you can use to predict what's likely going to happen. For newer players, I'm going to call out something specific, and that's that you should proactively be keeping an eye on the general card advantage in a game. In short, keep track of how many cards your opponents have in play and how many they have in their hand, and then check whether they have more than you, or if it's a commander game, more than anyone else. Too often I'll see newer players identify someone with a handful of creatures in play but no cards in their hand as the major threat, whereas someone with marginally less threatening board but a stack full of 7 cards in their hand is seen as entirely innocent. Then surprise surprise, the player with the full grip takes over the game seemingly out of nowhere. Coming back to reading the information in the game, I'll use an example from last night when I faced one of my favorite people to play against at my Pauper locals. I think he's probably one of the best players there, and he often plays a Flickertron deck. This matchup is a real grind for me and my Dimir control deck, and last night he asked me how many counterspells were in my graveyard and in exile. The answer was 3. You can now look at my deck and see how many cards there are, and make a rough judgment call on how likely it is that I have a counterspell in hand before he makes his next attempted play to win the game. Keeping in mind what I just said about bluffing, if he has a way of finding protection for his win condition easily, he may choose to do that prior to trying to win. Or if he doesn't, he'll just make the play anyway, since both of us are basically top decking given the late game nature of our matchup. Reading the cards in play to help you make judgment calls on how and when you use your interaction, and how and when you play your spells, is a critical part of winning in Magic. Also, I can't stress this enough, but pick up and read what your opponent's cards do. You'd be surprised how often you, or even they, have misread or misunderstood the effect that a card has, potentially accidentally, or if they're a deviant, intentionally, giving them far more than what they should get from a card or an effect. And that can definitely cost you the game. The same way you should be reading the game state, you should also be reading your opponents. Which spells they play, the order that they play them in, how long they think, and how fast they pass priority, and even how they tap their lands can all provide valuable tells or information. For example, if I'm playing against the multicolor blue deck, but they've tapped their lands in a way where they only have 1 blue mana up, it means that they likely don't have a counterspell in hand, because if they did, they'd quite likely not have done that. The next turn, where they now leave 2 blue mana untapped, you likely know that unless they've drawn a lot of cards between then and now, there's a good chance that they're bluffing. That's obviously not guaranteed, but so much of playing Magic against the same people over and over, like your friends or your playgroup at the LGS, comes down to playing the person as much as it is playing against the deck. Knowing whether someone's newer or more experienced, or whether they're more aggressive or more cautious, all have an impact. And the only way you'll pick up on it is by paying attention. I am both a cautious and greedy player. Now there's a bit of a dichotomy in there, but in general I like to have options, and this means that I favor not hard committing to a play. It's partially for this reason that I like control decks so much, because I have more choices and more ability to sit back and make decisions. Other people, and maybe you, are completely different. Some have much more of a fuck it we ball mentality. We are recklessly tapping out, slinging spells, with seemingly no thought of the consequences. Regardless of which extreme you fall on, or perhaps somewhere in the middle, knowing your own inherent biases and weaknesses will help you overcome your blind spots. As a practical example, I realize that sometimes I just need to commit to a play. I'll call back to the earlier Dimir control turned aggro scenario. What my deck, and more importantly my brain, wants to do is to play a second blue mana source on turn 2 and pass the turn ready to interact. But what that game really needs for me is to instead play a threat like a sneaky snacker that I can start pressuring my opponent. By tapping out on turn 2, I've now given them the chance to do what they want, but who cares? Because I've learned that the likely consequences of me playing slow are very bad. So in this scenario, I need to push myself out of my comfort zone or I simply won't win. Knowing your own biases and then observing and learning your opponent's ones will help you overcome yours, but also use your opponents against them. Now, Commander brings a ton more dynamics to the game that can cause you to lose. These are simple but important, so for my Commander audience, I'm going to speedrun a few of them. If you want to talk about them or want some insight, yap at me in the comments located conveniently below the like button. First up, remember that when you're trading 1-for-1 with an opponent, you're both going down a card and the 2 other opponents are secretly winning from that exchange. Be very selective with single target removal. Then don't forget that life is a resource, like card draw or mana. You can win the game on 5 life as easily as you can win the game on 40 life, so don't feel like you need to stay at high life totals. Know that being the threat will almost always see you losing the game. Winning a game of Commander is often achieved by perfectly timing how fast you accelerate along your game plan and how you manage tempo, and becoming the threat only at a point that it's almost too late for the table to stop you. Next up, related to reading the game state, you really need to make sure that you understand threat assessment. Someone with a handful of removal spells but no idea how to use them can completely ruin a game of Commander, and using them badly, or worse yet, having no removal, will almost certainly lose you the game. If someone targets you or removes your stuff, don't get too drawn into a vendetta where your whole game is taken over by trying to take that specific player down. Don't get me wrong, that can actually be incredibly fun and hilarious if you're playing with good friends, but it's almost certainly not going to win you the game, and more importantly, if you're playing at your LGS, it definitely won't win you any new friends. Think ahead when other players are taking their turns. It helps a lot when you have to make complex decisions later on your turn. But also, if you need some time, don't be afraid to take it, as long as you're not spending 10 minutes thinking over simple plays round after round. And last but not least, even if you're a very new player, don't worry too much about the impacts, either positive or negative, of your decisions and your plays. Channel some of that fuck it we ball attitude and just tap out and sling your spells. As long as you're learning each time you do that, before you know it, you'll be a pro. This has been focused on the in-game play mechanics far more than deck building mechanics, partially because I've yapped about deck building a whole lot. But if you want the same sort of video, but for things to think about before you sit down at the table, hit me with a gib please in the comments. I hope that you found this useful, and if you want to support what I do, smash up the like button or head over to my Patreon, and a big thank you to everyone that supports me over there. I really appreciate it. And if you want some personal tailored help, or you're just horribly rich and want to jettison some money, you can find that over on my Ko-fi. All of which you can find the links to down below the like button. If you enjoyed this, go and check out one of these 2 videos, and as always, thank you for being here.